Hey, this is Jess from Fourth and Birch. Join me while we make this alcohol ink swirl beach tumbler. All right, let's talk about the alcohol ink colors that we're going to use. I like to use a lot of them. I think they blend a little better when you use a lot. So first for the bottom, for the sand and the beach, we're going to use caramel and latte and a little bit of brass mixed in. So these three colors are the caramel, and then the two lighter yellowish ones are the latte. And for the brass, I take just a brass metallic alcohol ink and I mix it with a 1-to-1 ratio with alcohol. All right, let's talk about our blues. We're going to start, and you can see the color in front of it: Patina, Pool, Mermaid, Turquoise, Baja blue, Sailboat blue, and Sapphire blue. And we're going to try to go mostly in that order. As far as spray paints on the base, I did most of it white with my UltraFlat white Krylon ColorMaster. At the bottom, I used this iron lac gold just because I wanted a little bit more of the gold brown underneath where the beach was going to go. All right, next what we're going to do is mix up. This is a 20-ounce skinny, but I have numerous plans for this. A little bit I'm going to separate and be some white that I'm going to mix in. So we're going to do that, plus we're going to put on clear, so mostly clear. Anyway, so I'm going to mix up 30 cc's or 30 milliliters of my SwiftPoxy, which is a brand by Tumblerpoxy. So I'm going to get that going here. When I won't show you the whole mixing up, but I will talk to you a little bit about why I like to use the SwiftPoxy. You certainly can use any epoxy. If you use a faster setting like SwiftPoxy, you do have to work a lot faster with what you're doing because this sets up, you don't have a ton of work time. I've done these for a long time, and I still feel rushed when I do them. However, I do like the faster set because once I get it where I like it at the end, I don't want my colors to continue spinning, to continue mixing, and continue running horizontally, I guess, along my cup. And so I hurry through the process, I get what I want, and then I know that very soon it should start setting. So when I walk away from it, that's pretty close what it's going to look like when it cures. So if you're just starting off, I would recommend not using something that sets quickly, and it'll give you a little more work time, a lot more work time actually. And then you can just kind of see how things flow, how they go. You might not like the finished product as much. Again, it swirls more and blends more, and I mean that looks okay too. It's just not what I'm going for, especially with putting my waves on and whatnot. I like the distinct colors somewhat, and then just to blend a little bit and swirl into each other a little bit. So that's my preference. But again, you have to work pretty quickly. So I don't have a lot of time in this video that I am going to be pointing out specific things along the way and show you up close on the camera like I sometimes do. Again, just because I know I don't have a lot of time to spare. So that's what this voiceover is for, is to kind of see if we can pull out some of those specific things I want to point out to you. All right, so let me finish mixing my epoxy and I will be back shortly. All right, so the first part here is going to look a little odd. I'm just going to put epoxy on the gold area, the bottom as well, but kind of just the gold area. I forgot to portion some of it out for my white later, so put maybe 10 cc's in another cup, and I'm going to set that aside for later. But so here I'm going to smear on. So sometimes what happens, if you epoxy your entire cup, and you start, like for instance, I would put on drops of one of the brown colors, like the caramel or the latte. What happens is if your cup is at all the tiniest bit not level, uneven on your table, your brown could almost kind of get sucked up towards the top of the cup. So I don't want that. I don't want any brown really mixed in with my blue. It's okay right where they meet, but I don't want brown halfway up my cup. And same thing with my blue. I don't want my blue all the way down into my brown. I want it to be somewhat distinct. So I am just putting a layer of epoxy right on the bottom, and I'm going to just drip my browns in. I'm going to do both the caramel and the latte first. And make sure to get your bottom as well. Here's my next brown. I think this one is the Latte, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll get that turning and swirling first. Again, don't forget to put some drops of that on your bottom. My hands here are a little full of epoxy, and I'm getting it all over my alcohol ink bottle, which I really don't want to do. So just a second for that. Now I'm going to come through with my brass. This is Tim Holtz brass, but if you do just straight up brass from the bottle, it's kind of clumpy and it kind of takes over the tumbler. Whereas if you mix it with a 1-to-1 ratio with just straight up 90-something% rubbing alcohol, you can do the 91 or any, just a fairly high concentration of alcohol. 1-to-1 mixture, it thins the metallic brass out nicely, that it swirls instead of clumps and takes over. So I'm going to let that do its thing down on the bottom. As you can see, it's riding up just a tiny bit on my cup, but not much. Again, if I would have done this with a fully epoxied cup, that brown would be potentially up to the top of my cup by now. So that is how I avoid that. So I'm just getting my rim really well. I like to make sure I have epoxy over the entire rim. So that's what I'm doing here. I like to make sure that I have full coverage, full sealing of my epoxy up to the top. Another thing, when we are doing these alcohol swirl tumblers where we put epoxy on and then drip our alcohol inks on, I do a thicker coat of epoxy than I would normally do on a cup. This is a little more of what I would consider a flood layer, which maybe I would put on top of a chunky glitter mix or something like that. So more than you would think. It's going to look kind of a little gloppy. We don't want a ton, like we don't want it dripping off everywhere because it'll take your color with, but we want extra volume of epoxy going around. So when we do put the alcohol inks on, it gives it a little more fluidness to swirl with each other. So now I'm trying to meet my epoxy that I had put on earlier. So it gives my alcohol inks a little time to kind of settle in place. But when my new fresh epoxy here meets my brown, it is going to start mixing a little bit. You can kind of see there I'm moving my brown around. And again, this is totally okay. This creates a few problems. You can see it smearing there a little bit. You can see the clear epoxy right there kind of dipping into my brown. Oh, that's okay. I can put more colors on later. I can fix this a little bit, but this I have found is one of the best ways to not completely mix up when you have a big color change. When I do my blues, I don't mind as much. My blues can swirl into each other and it ends up looking good, but the blues into the brown or the brown into the blues, I like to keep it somewhat separated. So I'm just kind of smoothing out my epoxy. This does not have to be great. You don't have to get rid of your bubbles really right now because we're going to add heat to this. We're going to add a lot of alcohol inks and that's going to move this around and kind of slosh it around. So don't spend too much time on that, especially if you're using a fast set epoxy. So, all right, I have my epoxy pretty much all over my cup. We are going to get started here pretty soon with the inks. And I'm going to do them for the most part in the order that I had showed you them on the paper towel earlier. So we'll start kind of more with the greens, then or the turquoise-ish. We'll go into the more bluish, darker turquoise, and then into the blues, and then finally the dark blues. So this is my next color, but you see I kind of swirl into the last color, especially if I missed a spot. We want most full coverage. If you have a little white peeking out, it's not the end of the world. But as far as waves go, we're going to add white later, that little bit that I portioned to the side. So when you do this part, when you're doing your strips of blue, you want to keep in mind a little bit how many colors you have to do. I think after this blue, I think I have 2 more blues. So just something to partition a little bit so all the colors are about the same width. And if you miss, see kind of right there, I have kind of some white showing. It was a little larger of an area. I just came back and put a color. It might not even have been the right color that was in that area, but it's going to add a little bit of swirling of the colors, so it's okay. I probably wouldn't come and put one of these dark blues way down by my beach, but you certainly could. I do like to get all the way up to the very top of the rim. When you do these type cups, the epoxy does, and the color kind of pulls away from your rim a little bit, and we'll see that at the end. So you want to make sure you get all the way up if you can. I'm trying to turn it to go the opposite direction here. There we go. You want to do that just every now and then just to keep things flowing a little more randomly. So I'm just going through and adding a little more where I have some larger white spots. And that's pretty covered. All right, now that I have pretty much all the color on that I'm going to use my heat gun. And I'm not going to blow this around. I'm not going to put the blowing pressure on high, nor am I going to use my thin tip. I'm just adding a little heat to this, and you will see a little bit of the color start to move. I don't want to add too much heat, especially with the fast setting epoxy. That will kind of speed the process along and make it cure even faster than it is. But you can kind of see it's kind of starting to swirl around. And I'm picking my tumbler up. I'm tilting it by the tumbler turner base. So I like to do this on one of my freestanding turners. So this makes it easy for me, but you can see right there, you can see kind of some of the gold mixing into that green and some of the blues mixing into each other too. One of my browns or my brass is creating a lot of fisheyes on the bottom, which is okay. It's just, it's pulling the epoxy away from the tumbler. When we're totally done with this layer, we are definitely gonna go back and sand out some high and low places and put more epoxy over, so I'm not extremely worried about fisheyes. You are going to get those with this method, but it also doesn't allow the colors to swirl very well in those areas. So sometimes I like to just try to fix them a little bit with my metal tool. So here what I'm doing, this is the little bit that I set aside. I'm putting some PoxyWaves. It's white pigment by Tumblerpoxy. And it also, when you add a decent amount of heat to it, it creates cells, like little feathery, almost bubbly looking, but it doesn't bubble up. It's almost like little holes, I guess, little feathery holes. This a little bit goes a really long way, and this can kind of take over your tumbler very easily. So I'm kind of squishing my little medicine cup here and trying to get pretty thin layers, and you'll see why in a little bit. I also want most of my lines to be going in a somewhat, if you were looking at the cup sitting on a table, in a horizontal fashion. I don't really want to go up and down, or in this the way you're looking at it right now, I don't want to go right to left, because that's not typically how the wave progression is. So you want to keep, for the most part, in the same direction-ish. Now I'm going to take my torch. So this is going to start heating the epoxy up a lot faster. I'm just doing tiny, tiny little spurts. And right now I'm just focusing on my white, because that's what's going to get these really nice cells. But as you can see towards the bottom, right where that green is meeting the brown, the epoxy is what I call running away, where it basically likes to just form a line and swirl right there. It wants to swirl all the way around my tumbler. And that is just a pet peeve of mine. I hate those. It doesn't look natural with a natural swirl of what I'm trying to do. If I wanted a cup with a bunch of those horizontal lines, that would be fine, but I don't want that here. Those irritate me so much. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a lot of tipping back and forth. So right there, we're kind of saving it. You see how it's swirling more into the other colors from in this angle from left to right. So I'm gonna watch that. What happened was that epoxy got pretty warm, and that was just from me putting the torch on it, but you need to use the torch. So it's a very fine line and a game almost that you have to watch. You want the heat, you want what it does, but you also have some things to fix because of it. So I put a little bit more of the PoxyWave mixed into my epoxy in my gold because I didn't really have too much of that down there. And again, I'm just tilting this just to help things move from one color into the other, so it's more of a swirl. There I have another little dude running away there. You can see the green into my gold. It's turning into a runaway line, so I'm still tipping, and we're at least kind of running away up and down into some other colors, so I am much happier with that. Yep, still have that kind of turquoise area down near my brown. It's still making those lines and running away. So I'm gonna keep focusing on that. I'm pretty happy with my darker blue up towards the top. I don't need to do much to that. But we're gonna watch this line here. You could take your popsicle stick or your stirrer or my metal tool there. I could kind of drag it through that line. Sometimes that makes it look better. Sometimes it makes it look less organic, less swirled. You can almost see that you physically did something to it. So I try to refrain from that. I try to do this stuff first, these techniques of tipping, being very cautious with adding any more heat. See tiny little flicks of heat there just to get a little bit of it moving. But see, we've kind of fixed it. We've saved it. I don't really have any of those lines that are, there's one a little bit, but it's actually mixing into my other colors just fine. So I'm pretty happy with that. But worst case scenario, if it is not cutting it, I'm still with those runaway lines, then I might take my metal tool as kind of a last ditch effort just to stop the runaway lines. So another technique we can use is, I'm not 100% happy with that little runaway dude. I am taking just a general straw and blowing through it. And this gives at least a little more of a natural look versus taking my tool. You have to be a little careful with this. You don't want to be overzealous. It actually doesn't take much of a puff of air, or it pushes your epoxy completely like away, like it gives you almost like a bald spot on your cup. So you have to be really careful with this. But if you do have any areas, like a couple of those white lines here in my dark blue are looking a little more line-ish versus wave-ish. So you can just fix little areas with that. And it gives you a little more of a pinpoint, precise location. And you don't have to use your like heat gun or anything like that. It's totally cool air, so you're not heating anything up. It's just pushing the epoxy in specific directions. Here I'm using my tool. I have just kind of a big area, like a fisheye area almost. And I just wanted to smooth that a little bit just to try to put a little more epoxy there. But not mess around with it too much. But again, you have to be okay with fisheyes at least in this first layer. I've never done one of these where I haven't had at least a couple. Some big, some small. You just have to deal with it, let it go. And we will definitely sand around those and fix it in the next layer. All right, so let's get a little closer look at some of those swirls. I do see some air bubbles right there, kind of halfway down in my blue, that I'll go back after I put my camera down and just kind of carefully pop those with a torch. I don't want to add, again, too much heat or movement to this though, but there was just a couple bubbles there. You'll see my brown sand area is pretty bumpy, where you can see the light reflecting off the epoxy. That's probably where I'm going to get a decent amount of like fisheyes and whatnot. You can see that here again. It's just bumpy. It's okay. It's all from just dropping these alcohol inks on this. right here, that's kind of that feathery cell look that I was talking about. And when you get a white additive like the PoxyWaves, that's what you're going to get. If I had this on another project where I could add more heat to it, and if I did add more heat, I would have many, many more cells. But again, we would be chasing these little runaway horizontal streaks forever and a day and trying to fix them if I added more heat than I did. So it's really just a balancing act. All right, so here's where we are for the time being. I'm going to let this spin under my heat lamp. I tend to use my heat lamp for my fast curing epoxies to help them dry, not very sticky, and cure well. And then I will be back when this is cured, show you what it looks like, and get ready for prepping for the next layer of epoxy. All right, so here we go. This is after it is cured. So this is definitely not the only layer of epoxy we're going to do. This will have bumps and fish eyes and little waves, and it's not totally smooth. So we need to clean up our rim and decide what we're going to do with it. If we want it just to look like this and be done, then we will sand the fish eyes and the areas that we need to smooth out and put potentially a last layer of epoxy on it. If we want to put decals or anything else on it, we still need another layer of epoxy so it's nice and smooth. Then we can decal it up, whatever we want to do, and throw then the potential last layer of epoxy. So thank you everybody, I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to say, utilize the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you next time.